Hello, and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout on Air 2 for Adam, Melodie, and Stefanie. And I understand Melodie was moderating this one. I am going to go over some of the strong points of your Hangout, and then I'm going to comment on a few things that I think could have be enhanced with a more engaged discussion. So with respect to the question 1 on heedfulness, or the ability to have an attentive orientation and collaborative orientation as far as leadership in the onset of an event with high consequences and high risk that can potentially become intractable with poor decision making from the onset. You had some good discussions on the situational awareness. Adam was talking about that situational awareness that was critical to understanding the hardships the other people go through, and the interference of egos. I think that was a really good point on the arrogance and inability to have a reflective practice. And this links to the egos, linked to what is frequently referred to as emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is not part of our course, but I think it's very fitting in here. But very often we focus on critical skills and knowledge required from experienced incident commanders, and we stress the domain knowledge and subject matter expertise. You had another question about experience there, but as you look at the stories of those different incident commanders that are in your Flynn and Arbuthnot book on from different agencies in different critical events, you can discern less of the competencies that are related to actual domain knowledge, even though those are a prerequisite to any good incident commander. But you also see different variations of emotional intelligence. And what I mean emotional intelligence is the ability to think about the emotions that affect the actions, that affect the outcomes. And the domains of emotional intelligence, unlike IQ, is the ability to look at the relationships and the relationships between people in organizations, and areas such as optimism and empathy and social responsibility and flexibility and adaptation and self-regard, and all those are elements of emotional intelligence. And if you're interested in the topic of emotional intelligence, David Goldman has some really good readings on that. But situational awareness, take, for example, the Navy commander that was taking Her Majesty's ship to the operation in the Falklands during the Falkland War. You can see how those little pieces of assessing the relationships of the commander to the crew, to the shifts, to the people working decks, to the environment as a whole, were really critical in their ability to have that future orientation towards, the particular outcomes. And I think that that aspect in command and leadership is often ignored, but studies have shown, and that's, on the side, that IQ actually accounts for about 6% of the success in organizations. It's the emotional intelligence, which, unlike IQ, can be developed through the late stages in life. IQ, it's what we got, it's what we have by the time we reach puberty. You're not going to increase it very much more. Whereas those domains of building relationships with others and situating oneself within the environment with others was a predictor. It's probably about 50 or 60% of the success of a particular individual. So take that as sort of that additional competency required of good leaders. And if you look at good leaders, you'll probably be able to discern what motivates people, how people develop trust around certain individuals. And you will notice that if you were to, let's say, pick the best boss in the world and the worst boss in the world, most likely the critical things that you expect the best boss in the world to have is not going to be their writing skills. It's not going to be, how many classes they've taken or how many degrees they have. But at the end of the day is whether they micromanage, whether they are arrogant, whether they are demeaning, whether they are dismissive, whether they take other points of view into equation. So this is, sort of with that question on heedfulness, the emotional intelligence certainly comes to play, and again linked to situational awareness as well. You talked about with respect to the question on years of experience not being correlate to actual ability to be a good decision maker. And I think Adam mentioned that, relevant experiences were important, but it's the future orientation and achievement orientation that are also very meaningful, because somebody can be assigned to a particular position for many years doesn't mean that they're actually a good decision maker. So the tenure is not necessarily a reflection of a good leader. And certainly there are two angles to that. In crisis management and emergency management, a lot of times events happen and they get resolved. And for better and worse, sometimes they have positive outcomes in spite of incident commanders, because the teams are good, or people are committed, or the circumstances are favorable, such as you mentioned a lot about Boston Marathon bombing, and take the case of hospitals, for example. The fact that it happened at the time when it happened, where there was a shift change and there was double the amount of personnel that would have typically been on site, is definitely a favoring factor in that event. So that's just an example of how sometimes experience itself does not mean that it is a good experience if it's not reflected upon after the event. And if things go well, typically we do not scrutinize those incidents or those decisions quite as diligently as we do when things go wrong. And that brings me to this very frequent attitude among many decision makers that are not very open to change, is that we have always done things that way and it's always worked out for us. So that's one aspect of that experience, that experience that is not supported with thoughtful analytical process throughout somebody's career and learning and developing that future orientation, getting the research, getting those analytical decision-making components that you had in a discussion board last week. It's very important to mitigate future events that might bring different opportunities, a lack of opportunities that might have totally different circumstances in them. And of course, on the other hand, there is that experience in years. Some people are just assigned in place, or they are put in positions that they perform certain tasks even though they might not have expertise, and expertise is really important. So I think the whole point of this conversation is that it's to realize that even the most seasoned people in organizations need to be lifelong learners, because, again, that hones their emotional intelligence and enhances their situational awareness day to day, so they don't become complacent. you had some interesting observations on swarm intelligence, and you identified those three components of it that the text talked about: the flexibility, the robustness, and self-organization. I'm not sure if you really linked to the concept of emergence. There's quite a lot of discussion on swarm intelligence as it occurred in Boston, where multiple operations were occurring at a time, medical emergencies, manhunt, and certainly a lot of competing priorities, and the people that were part of that decision-making group in that event worked very well together. They had worked together before, so they already knew who had what resources, and they were able to build that common operating picture. Definitely a big factor of that was that Boston medical system. There are hospitals that are under hospital incident command system, and they integrated and they internalized NIMS and trained with other law enforcement agencies, and the leaders sort of stepped back and allowed people with expertise do their jobs. You talked about the enemies of emergence or swarm intelligence, which was competitiveness and credit taking. And I think that, your discussions were very relevant and very salient. You did not make a whole lot of linkages to the actual video that in a second point of different competencies of incident commander, there were like at least 10 characteristics. You listed them. And you mentioned a few a little bit more in context, but that movie was a really excellent grounding material to sort of make linkages in many directions on risk, on safety, on trust building, on competing priorities of different agencies, and how do you overcome those barriers in adaptability, standard operating procedures, and how standard operating procedures do not work in those chaotic situations, as was the case in the Dirty War with the flume modeling for contamination and predicting wind direction and making decisions around that. So I think that the whole video is linking to those 10 characteristics of successful incident commanders could have been explored a little bit more in depth. Now, you did talk about the importance for swarm intelligence, the importance of trust and working together. And you looked into the command and control versus self-organization. And I think you had, the question was, are they command and control versus self-organization and emergence, are they mutually exclusive? And Adam, I think, initiated a discussion on that, that they sort of have to mesh together. Stefanie mentioned that you have to sort of rethink from that community resilience and spontaneous action that is builds self-sustainability and lack of dependence. At some point, that resilience might not be enough, and you go into those processes and structures that are supposed to facilitate a little bit more streamlined process, particularly from people with high expertise in a domain. Your on the swarm intelligence was really good, and your discussion on heedfulness was very good. I think that where your discussion sort of fell short is to explore more of the Flynn and Arbuthnot stories and link them a little bit more to the decision making and situational awareness. And I think it didn't help that at some point of the video we were losing Adam, so a lot of the discussion Adam was going in and out, and I think you were driving during the the Hangout. So that's probably affected the flow as well, and some of the information for me got lost. So obviously, command and control, as depicted, I think one of you mentioned the 9/11 Commission report, that it was identified that things work so much better in Pentagon response because the people actually did come together and collaborated and knew, had that situational awareness, what the resources were in the area and who to call, and how to develop that ad hoc decision-making group, because they have done it before. And that goes back to planning and targeting certain capabilities with that future orientation goal. So my comments on that Hangout for you are not very extensive. I just looked at my general notes on that, on relevant experiences, egos, arrogance, politicization. Certainly emergency managers and public servants tend to stay in their careers or have straighter paths in their particular functions and roles, and they collect more experience along the way. Elected officials and politicians, as we know, their tenures are shorter. They move from assignment to assignment, and as you could see very well, those are not always the people, even though they're in charge of executive decisions, they're not always the people that have the most domain knowledge. So for politicians and elected officials, I think that awareness or emotional intelligence of people in different ranks and in different organizations that might have more input is very critical. And certainly this wasn't a case of the mayor of or Prime Minister of London, whatever her function was, who was clearly a new appointee that was trying to navigate through quite terrains that were not in her area of expertise, and who was very dismissive of concerns brought about by watch commanders, about the exercises and realistic exercises, about having her agenda on assuaging the public and providing false assurances, where actually there were warning signs that that heedfulness certainly from her wasn't there, and certainly competitiveness to be in front of the media with little awareness of the situation and providing briefs where she wasn't even aware that the decontamination corridors and those cordons are going to be shifting because the situation shifted as well. So there's, again, going back to ego, but it's also going back to looking how elected officials and politicians are mashed into crisis management, and what needs to be done for them to have a better platform to understand those issues, or at least to understand that they are not the smartest person in the room. And I think acknowledging that you are not the smartest person in the room, it's a really great quality of any leader or incident commander in that particular case, because incident commanders are really as good as the capital that they amass around them. So with respect to your Google Hangout free, Adam sent me your Hangout, and I know you've completed it, and it was a full 57 minutes, and so you had a good discussion around it, but I can only see 18 minutes of it. So one suggestion was that you retape it at the end of your last Hangout, number 4, that's due by this Wednesday. I leave it up to you how you want to solve it, but I think that I would like to hear from you and have a follow-up and full voice on that particular planning scenario that you had, and this way you can possibly have a little bit more opportunity to add to it, so I don't have to judge it just on a fragmentary evidence. So I want to thank you, Melodie. Thank you for facilitating the session. And Stefanie and Adam, thank you for your input. And I'm looking forward to your looking at your discussion boards from week 4, and also to getting the last Hangout sort of wrapped up, maybe with some follow-up at the end on the part that is missed from the material that you submitted. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.